Okay, so we are starting the whole lecture, and the next one is on cosmological period, remember, and we did say that it starts around 585 before Christ and runs up roughly until middle of the 5th century. 5th century would be around the year 450, so it's about 135 years or so. The two questions they were concerned with back then: what is fundamentally real? Why does change happen? Well, they were concerned with more than that, but we'll concentrate on these two because these two are most important. We call their point of view, traditionally, it's closest to monism. Monism is the idea that everything is made of one thing. Like mono, one. So the first philosophers we'll talk about, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, which are known as Milesians or Ionians, because they all come from a city of Milesus in the province of Ionia, all three of them. So these Milesians or Ionians are all considered monists, because they were looking for this one thing underlying all reality. Okay, let's look at the map so you could know where it is. This is the map. Let me blow it up a little bit. Yeah. So this is Greece, right? This is Greece the way it is today. We have Athens right here. This is Athens. Across the Aegean Sea, this is where Turkey is now. That used to be Ionia. So they are called Ionians because they come from this area, and Milesians because they specifically come from here. This is Miletus. This is the city of Miletus. Again, today it is Turkey. Back then it was Greek colony. Greek people from the mainland were kind of transferring here, sailing in the boats, setting up colonies there, and so on. And it so happens that the first three philosophers all come from this area, and for this reason they're called Ionians or Milesians. Now we will learn a couple of Greek words today, again, because that will greatly help us to understand what is going on. If you use the English language, you may not understand the subject as well. Even though I do not expect you guys to learn ancient Greek, but we will learn a few words and it will help us. So the first word is Arkhe. It actually is right there on the board. So why do we care? Because this is exactly what they were looking for. Arkhe in Greek has two meanings. It's like a foundation or the first principle of everything, and the way Greek people understood it is, first of all, it is an original state out of which manifold world has developed. So today, for example, what we would say is Arkhe in this sense. Where did the state of the world as we know it develop from? Do you know physics? Anything about modern physics? Well, Big Bang, right? You heard about Big Bang. That's where everything started. So the Big Bang would be the Arkhe. But another meaning of the same word is the permanent ground of being a substratum. Substratum essentially meaning what is inside everything. What is everything made of literally? And that would be a different meaning of this same word, and that would be what we today call particles, right? Fundamental particles of reality. So to understand what they were doing, they were kind of looking for both, because to them it was the same word. They were trying to find what is this most fundamental element of reality, and also what started the reality. How did reality come about? And it was kind of related to them. So, Thales. We started with Thales last time. Let's look at him a little bit closer. Who was Thales? Well, we actually don't know very much about Thales. We know he lived roughly, and again, this is rough, between 624 and 545 BC, before Christ. And remember, it goes backwards, right? Today we are saying somebody is born in the year, say, 2000, and now 2020, so it's kind of later on. Note that in case of Thales and all of them, we're going kind of backwards. He was born in 624, but he died in 545, right? But that's because we are moving towards the birth of Christ rather than away from it. So everything goes backwards for us. Not for them, they had different calendar, but for us it is. And it also means that he mostly was active somewhere around 2,600 years ago. very long time ago. He is considered the first philosopher. No work of his survives. So how do we know anything about him? We know things about him from the testimony of other people. Whoever actually read his work or was familiar with it and later wrote something about it. In many cases, it was hundreds of years later. So it's not really that reliable, but it still is interesting. So he supposedly predicted this solar eclipse. How did he do it? This is the quote we have from Herodotus. Herodotus was a historian who lived much closer to Thales, although again a few hundred years later, but nonetheless not 2,600 years later as we do. And this is what he said. As they were having equal success in the war, and there was a war at the time, it happened that in the 6th year, when a battle was being fought, the day suddenly became night. Thales of Miletus has foretold to the Ionians that this loss of daylight would occur, setting as a limit the very year in which the event occurred. So, he did not predict a date. That would be impossible at the time. But he predicted a year. He said that in that year there will be a solar eclipse. The sun will become covered. The day will turn night. I guess it especially impressed them because there was a war. And you know, when people in a battle losing their lives, they are impressed by things like this. So somebody heard his prediction, probably didn't pay much attention, thought, some crazy guy, who knows what he's predicting. And then it actually happened during the battle. And people were like, oh my God, how did he know? So this is one of the reasons he's considered one of the 7 sages, or the wisest people of antiquity. This is one of the reasons. There are several other reasons. There is a bunch of stories about him. We don't know how reliable they are, but a couple of them are quite interesting. One of them comes from Plato, who wrote about it again a couple of hundred years later. And Plato says this story, which is kind of makes philosophers look a little silly. He says, they say that once when Thales was gazing upwards while doing astronomy, he fell into the well, and that a witty and charming Thracian serving girl made fun of him for being eager to know the things in heavens, but failing to notice what was just behind him and right by his feet. So basically, he was gazing at the stars or whatever and fell into the well, and then she was laughing at that and saying, oh, those philosophers, they just look upwards, but they don't look in front of them. Another story we have about him from Aristotle, I don't have a quote here, but it also is kind of interesting because it continues on the same subject. Aristotle tells us that Thales was actually trying to prove later on that he is not, philosophers are not completely, philosophy is not completely pointless. And you can actually live with philosophy if you want to. Philosophers don't want to be rich, but if they want to, they can. And he tells the following story. He says that Thales, again using astronomy and mathematics, was able to predict that there'll be a huge they were growing olives at the time. So he was predicting that there'll be a huge crop of olives in Greece that season. And nobody else knew about it yet. So he put up the deposits for all the presses. They were pressing olive oil with the press. Today you can also buy the olive oil from Greece. They were pressing it, and in order to do that, they needed to use the press. So he put up the deposits to control all the presses in Greece ahead of time, when nobody even knew about the crop. When the crop actually came, people started looking for a press, and he charged them a lot of money because he had a monopoly at that point. He had all the presses under his control. So he made a lot of money on that, and that was serving as the proof that, you know, philosophy can actually make you rich. It's not that philosophers can't be wealthy. They just don't want to be wealthy, but they can if they want to. So Arche, according to Thales, again as Aristotle tells us, is water. He thought water is the Arche. So this is this one fundamental element which underlies all things. Again, in two senses. First of all, he thought, of course, as Arche, that would be what is inside everything. And Aristotle says, well, maybe that he thought that because, you can find water in human beings. If you poke them, blood comes out. It's kind of like water. In sperm, this is where human beings come from. It's kind of watery. And all sorts of things you can find water inside. So he thought that that's one of the reasons. And another reason is, again, as we actually know from science today, life did come out of water, didn't it? But that's why we're looking for water even on Mars. Because if we find water, we will know there's life. Life and water are very closely connected indeed. And so that may have been also his reasoning in a sense, even though he couldn't discover it as well as we do. But who knows, he may have actually seen some of these fossils which they discover by the sea, which tells us that life actually did come from sea. So for all these reasons, perhaps he decided that water is this arche, the fundamental element. Another thing on change, that's kind of interesting because they were not atheists, of course, but in the same time they rejected this idea of anthropomorphic gods who live on Mount Olympus or whatever and who are like humans. Because why would they do that? Well, because if you use your reasoning, it doesn't seem to make very much sense. Again, it's based on tradition, right? And they were rejecting the tradition. However, if you do not explain it in this way, how do you explain change and all other things? He was saying because everything is full of gods. Gods are everywhere. Gods are in things, in magnet, in particular. How does magnet move? And they had magnets too, right? How does it move metal? Well, because it has little gods inside of it. Everything moves because it has gods, including human beings. Our soul is also kind of a godlike force which moves us. So any change which happens happens because there is some sort of God inside of it. The word, it's known as hylozoism. Hylozoism basically means the view that matter itself has life. Like life is in matter. Now, this is pretty much all we will say about Thales, but Thales had a student, his follower, Anaximander. Anaximander was the next of the three Milesian or Ionian philosophers we will cover. He was younger than Thales. He lived roughly between 610 and 545, and he actually disagreed with his teacher. See, that's already an example of philosophy because he was not following the tradition. His teacher said that the most fundamental thing is water, but Anaximander disagreed with that. He said the most fundamental thing is what he called apeiron. Apeiron is the word which means indefinite or infinite, something like this, endless. So he was saying that it doesn't make any sense for things to be made out of water. They have to be made out of something, but that something we just cannot see. It's absolutely different from anything we can see. And that was his idea. He was saying that apeiron is what is inside everything. There is another quote from Aristotle. For some make the infinite apeiron, this, rather than air or water, so that others are not destroyed by one of them that is infinite. The idea here is, if it's water, it can be destroyed by, say, fire and so on, right? But that stuff is inside everything, so it cannot be destroyed by any other thing. Everything else contains some sort of opposite and is not stable in a way. But that apeiron is inside everything, and it would be stable. Also, again, remember, as Arche, this is the source of everything as well. So, not only apeiron is most fundamental element, apeiron is what essentially created stuff. So, another quote, this does not have an arche, but this seems to be the arche of the rest, and to contain all things and steer all things. So, there's no source of apeiron. Apeiron doesn't come from anything. Apeiron itself is the source of everything. And it does, in fact, kind of controls everything, because everything behaves according to that apeiron. It's an interesting idea, and he says it is deathless and indestructible. So essentially it's eternal, tiny little element which is inside everything, and it will never perish. It's always there, and it does by itself create all these things we see around us. He has an interesting quote about change and justice. How did he see it? He's saying that change is war in opposites, such as hot and cold. And he was saying that they are doing injustice on each other. Another interesting quote from a later commentator, Simplisticus, who says, the things that are perish into the things from which they come to be, according to necessity, and they pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice in accordance with ordering of time. So think about that. Basically what he is saying here is that when something becomes hot rather than being cold, it's being done in justice too. And to be just, you have to get it back to being cold. Things who are at war with each other doing injustice on each other. And justice is to restore it back to the original state. It's an interesting idea about what justice is. What justice is will be a big issue for us. Yeah, sure.
So his ideology with the hot and the cold is basically don't be like hot-headed and like think the situation out thoroughly, like just think it out and then like try to placate the situation instead of like saying something in the spur of a moment. Well, and doing something unjust like that.
Remember, we're talking about objects around us, right? We're not necessarily talking about human beings. But when you look, we don't do that now. We don't talk about justice and injustice, say, when volcano erupts. That's just one natural thing which happens. But to them, they still were trying to apply this idea of justice to inanimate things. So it is, in that sense, what they are trying to say is, well, what Anaximander is trying to say, is that when something which is originally cold, let's say a stone, becomes hot, it's been done injustice by the fire. And in order to restore justice, it has to get cold again. Because justice is to restore it to the original position.
Okay. All right. It's a little bit of a complex.
Like, it's weird for us because we don't think of it in this way.
To us. Yeah.
Yeah, but this is how they thought about that. Okay. And another revolutionary idea he had is about the Earth. He actually suggested this whole theory about how the universe is, how the cosmos is, and he suggested that the Earth is at the center and it's not resting on anything. So he did not think, unlike the poets, remember the poets had it resting on Tartarus and so on. To him, the Earth was in the middle. It's kind of like this flat surface, and it's in the middle of everything, and because it's in the middle of everything, it doesn't fall, because it's right at the center. So that kind of explains why it doesn't have to be on anything else. It doesn't need any kind of pole to stand on, because it's right at the middle. Very revolutionary idea for his time, and although his idea about the moon, the sun, and the stars was kind of weird and interesting too. So here's how he explained it. But we are surrounded by these like circles of fire. The biggest circle of fire is what we think the sun is. Then the moon is kind of a paler, other closer to our circle of fire. The closest circle would be the stars. Why do we see them as just either circle or dots? because there are holes, and we see it through those holes. It's kind of like, if you, in a wall, if you make several holes, and behind the wall you have this constant fire, you will see these tiny little dots. So that's how the stars are. They are like these tiny little holes in that circle, which we can see, and this is the closest to us. And the moon is a bigger hole, one bigger hole, and the sphere themselves are rotating around the Earth, so you can see them in different positions like this. But nonetheless, they are not one object. They are just this circle of fire, and the hole is in the that sphere which surrounds us. This is how he thought the universe is. Okay, now we move into the third and last Milesian, Anaximenes. Anaximenes, we don't know exactly his dates of when he lived. He was a student of Anaximander. So Anaximander, student of Thales, Anaximenes, student of Anaximander. Probably was alive and active around 545. That's about all we know. He disagreed with his teacher too, because to him, air, he seemed like the Arche. Air because it's most pervasive. And he actually explained it in terms of what we may say today physics, in terms of like observation. So he was saying, for example, well, think about it. If something burns, right, where does it go? You take a log and you burn it. You have ashes left, but this is very little, right? The log is gone. Where did it go? Into the air. It became air again. So air is inside everything. That's the fundamental element. When air becomes thinner, it becomes fire, and we can see fire. When it becomes denser and thicker, it becomes those objects, such as stones and earth and other objects. It is cold and moist. Cold and moist air. So you can actually turn it back into the air if you burn it or something. It's obviously harder to burn the stone, but most objects you can burn, and then you will literally see it evaporating. So that's how he thought it is. And he even performed the first experiment, which he was trying to prove his theory by blowing on his hand. He was saying, if you blow on your hand like this, it's cold, right? But if you blow it on your hand like this, it's hot. Because your mouth, he was saying, has a much bigger hole. And so the air is more rarefied, thinner. So that's why it's warm. Of course, it's not how we would explain it today. Well, yeah, you can perform this experiment yourself and see whether it makes sense. Today we probably would explain it a little differently because of, physiology and all this stuff we know. But to him it was actually serving as a proof of his idea about air being the fundamental element of everything. So that's his idea of Arche. So the important distinction, which also you should learn at this point, guys, if you still don't know it, between materialism and immaterialism. The book talks about it a little more. So what is materialism? Materialism is a view that basic elements of reality are fundamentally physical, like tiny little objects of some sort. Immaterialism, on the other hand, is the view that reality is fundamentally made of non-physical elements. In particular, you can think of it as thought. All reality is thought. We will go back to it many times. It's a very important distinction in philosophy, and there is no way to determine one way or the other. There are opinions which support both of them, and of course, again, it's one of those things where we can't really rely on experience. We have to go with reason, and reason can go either way. However, there's very good defense of both points of view, and they are very important, and they're still with us today, and we still have not resolved it completely. Some people are materialists, and they say everything is physical. Physical laws explain everything. Some people are immaterialists, especially philosophers, and they say, no, actually that's not the case at all. Pre-Socratic philosophy did not those philosophers didn't think about it in this way, but we can still kind of apply it to them and try to think of them within the same distinction. So if we do, then we would call all the Ionians, all these three, we would call them materialists, because they basically are looking for this fundamental particle, which would be material particle. Even apeiron is essentially a type of matter, so it is material. We will see materialism later on. Now Pythagoras. This is the next philosopher we'll talk about. Fascinating stuff. Let's go into him a little bit deeper. Unfortunately, we don't know that much about Pythagoras himself. We know a lot more about Pythagoreans, his followers. Why? Well, there's several reasons. The most important reason, he was this mystical figure. He lived between 570 and 495 BC. When he was about 40 years old in 530, he had to leave his native town of Samos, and he immigrated to southern Italy, what today is southern Italy, to Croton. And in Croton he found this colony, which for all intents and purposes we can call religious cult, type of religious cult, what today we would call a cult. They had the secret rules. One of the rules, as far as we know, was that to join the cult, you had to remain silent for 7 years. 7 years you wouldn't say a word. Only if you passed that test, you could become one of them. Why? Because they thought what they knew was secret knowledge. You're not supposed to disclose it, tell it to anybody. So it's one of the reasons why we know very little about them. There are people who are still talking, especially later on. Some things did come out of this bubble, but they tried to keep it as a bubble. Eventually, 30 years later, around year 500 BC, one of the young aristocrats who wanted to join them was rejected. And he got so mad at them that he stirred up the politicians to drive them all away. So basically they were driven away from southern Italy. They dispersed all over Greece. And few years after that, actually 5 years later, Pythagoras himself died. However, his followers for about 100 years, they still had these communities spread around the area and tried to keep all this sacred knowledge. And well, they kind of divided into two different kinds, but we will talk about it in a second. So anyway, this is why we don't know as much about Pythagoras, although you probably heard about Pythagorean theorem, right? Well, we don't know whether Pythagoras himself had anything to do with it. However, his followers probably did, because he himself is a very mystical figure. He was considered like a god to them, right? Well, the typical thing when you have a religious cult of any sort even today, their leader is usually like this god-like figure. So he was just like that. So they thought that whatever ideas they had were coming from him. He was influencing them somehow. So even if somebody, one of his followers, would come up with an idea later, he would say that Pythagoras has influenced me, so it is his idea. And for this reason, it's kind of hard to figure out which ones were actually his ideas and which ones emerged later with his followers. Now, some of these ideas which we know of today are very interesting. One of them, called Metempsychosis, transmigration of the soul. So they basically believed that our soul is indestructible. It lives on. It just reborn. Every time you die, your soul is reborn as somebody else, be it a human being or an animal. So you never actually die. You become another creature. In fact, Pythagoras himself apparently was even saying to them who he was before he died, and he had like this whole long list of other humans who lived before, who he was supposedly before he became Pythagoras. This is the quote we have from Porphyry on the subject. Porphyry was saying, first he declares that the soul is immortal, then that it changes into other kinds of animals. In addition, that things that happen recur at certain intervals, that nothing is absolutely new, and that all things that come to be alive must be through thought akin. So essentially the idea is that even an animal may have been a human being. If you, for example, have a relative who passed away, well, and you encounter a kitty or somebody later on, maybe that's your relative, that kitty. You don't know that, but it is possible. His soul could have passed on. So what does it mean? Treat everybody like human beings, treat them nicely, because you never know who they are. They may have been human beings in previous life. Also, the idea of eternal recurrence. We will find it again in Nietzsche, fairly recent philosophy, the end of the class, but it goes back all the way to Pythagoreans, and the idea is this: there's only so many possible combinations the world can take. Sooner or later, all these combinations will be exhausted. But since the world exists eternally, everything will be repeated and repeated and repeated. So you will essentially live your life exactly the way you live in it now, again and again and again and again, endlessly. Eternal recurrence. So this is the idea which goes back to Pythagoreans. Now, two things we know about them. They had what they called Akousmata and Symbala. That was part of their teachings. Akousmata were this kind of oral sayings, and Symbala were the passwords which only they knew. Here's some examples of the Akousmata. What is most just? To sacrifice. What is the wisest? Number. And the second wisest is the person who assigns names to things. What is the wisest thing in our power? Medicine. What is the most beautiful? Harmony. They were fascinated with harmony and numbers, and they thought that the numbers actually can explain the entire universe. So now we'll just mention how they, after the death of Pythagoras, they split up into roughly two streams. One of them were called Akousmatikoi, and the other one Mathematikoi. Akousmatikoi were repeating those Akousmata, and one of the things about them, they thought that they should preserve all the teachings of Pythagoras exactly the way they were. Mathematikoi, on the other hand, thought that no, you can use it as a foundation and move on and discover other things based on math, based on numbers, because the number is the Arche. The number is the Arche. Think about it. They thought that the Arche, which is again, first of all, the first principle of everything, the beginning of everything, and the most fundamental thing is a number. So actually the science, when it eventually picked up using mathematics, Galileo was the first person using mathematics, trying to use mathematics to describe reality. Prior to Galileo, they didn't think about that. But it goes back all the way to Pythagoreans. They thought that actually you can use numbers and mathematics to describe everything. The whole reality is based on numbers. And one of the most fascinating things they discovered is there is direct relation between music and numbers. Now, I'm not a musician, so I can only roughly tell you, but if you know anything about music, you probably know more than me about that. But it basically has the length of the string. If you have string of any type of material and any pressure, but you divide it exactly in half, the sound it makes will go up 1 octave. So this is kind of direct relation which you will have between the pitch of the sound and the number. So this is kind of like the way it is represented. This is the full string, which you can think of as an X. Then half of it would be 1/2 X, 2/3 would be 2/3, and 3/4, and you get the sound are exactly proportional to that. The sound which it would make after you reduce the length of the string in this way. Homework actually has it as a simulation. You can see there much better than what I can tell you. But the point is that when they discovered it, they were fascinated, because for us it seems like, well, duh, I mean, we have digital music, right? We know that there is a relation between numbers and sounds. For them it was absolutely amazing, because they didn't know numbers and sounds can actually have this kind of beautiful harmony. So they thought that the number 10 is the magic perfect number. Why? Because if you look at it, so this would be 1, right? Then 1/2 would be 2, 1 over 2. 2/3 would be 2 over 3. 3/4 would be 3 over 4. But if you put it this way, it makes this kind of a perfect triangle, and there's exactly 10 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, if you add them up, makes 10. So they thought that was completely fascinating. And for this reason, they thought 10 would be the perfect number. And they had numbers for everything. Human being, for example, they thought was 5. And so on. So everything had a number, and that number was directly related to reality. They also thought that change happens because of the conflict between what they called order and disorder. So this is like 10 pairs, again, magic number 10, there are 10 of them. Order, limit, disorder, unlimited. Numbers, odd numbers were order, even numbers disorder. 1 is order, many is disorder, right is order, left disorder, male is order, female is disorder, rest is order, motion disorder, straight order, crooked disorder, light order, darkness disorder, good order, evil disorder, and square is order, oblong is disorder. So this 10 pairs is kind of like the two sides which conflict with each other. Yeah, I'm sorry. But, well, anyway, that's how they thought about that. So let's look at a few other things. So the first quote, this is slightly different translation, but the first quote is also important. This is beginning of his book, and it says, although this logos, and I deliberately also using the word logos because it's another Greek word on the board which we'll learn today. It's a very interesting word. Although this logos, which I shall describe, exists or is true forever, men prove as unable to understand it when once they have heard it as before they have heard it. For though all things come to pass in accordance with this logos, men seem as if ignorant when they experience such words and things as I set forth, distinguishing each thing according to its nature and telling how it is. The rest of mankind are unaware of what they do while awake, just as they forget what they do while asleep. So what he's saying is very few people understand logos. Most people are, well, to put it, we can put it this way, stupid. He thought very few people actually understand the reality, what's going on. And the word logos is this word which we will learn because it cannot be translated very well. Here is an interesting quote, and it actually is in Greek. And I wanted it to be in Greek because it will be easier for you to understand both words, arche and logos. In Greek it reads en arche hen ho logos, kai ho logos, hen proston theon, kai theon he ho logos. I'm sure that you heard it, and once we translate it, you will actually understand it. Some of you at least will remember it. So en arche is translated as at the beginning. Arche, remember, arche is the foundation of things, but it also is the beginning of things. In the beginning, there was a word. Logos translated as the word. So who remembers where it's from? At the beginning, there was a word. Bible, New Testament, John 1:1.
Bible.
That's exactly what it is. And it's translated that at the beginning there was word, and the word was with God, theon, and the word was God. Why do we even mention it in Greek? because in Greek it has so much deeper meaning than its English translation or Russian translation or any other translation. Exactly because, remember the word Arkhe, which is translated as beginning, at the beginning, it's not just beginning. It's essentially the foundation of everything. So what he's saying is the foundation of everything is logos. But logos, again, is not just word. Logos in Greek also means reason. So if you think about it in this way, what it says is the beginning of everything was reason, and the reason was with God, and the reason was God. So once you understand it in this way, know that it opens whole other meaning from the simple translation, which is at the beginning there was word. If you just read that, you may wonder, what the hell does it even mean? In the beginning there was word, so what? God said a word and that's it? No. Logos is much deeper word, which is why Heraclitus talks about logos. Logos is both. Logos is expressed in words, but it's not just any random word. It is the reason hidden in the words. And the word logike, from which the word logic derived, is again derived from the word logos. So logic itself, the rules of logic, is logos. And if you understand it, you understand the reality. The reality is based on reason. You have to understand this reason. It's not just a random bunch of opinions, traditions, myths, or whatever other nonsense. You have to find the reason behind everything. That's what logos is. Which is why it is important to understand this word in Greek rather than in English. Because the English translation, be it word or reason, loses the other part of the meaning. If you say it's reason, then you're no longer talking about the word. But it is word, it's words. However, if you just say words, you're losing the point that it's not just any word. It's a reason. It's the logical word. It's the word which describes reality rather than whatever other word. So this is why in Heraclitus, that is one of the most important contributions. Now, how did he explain change? He actually was saying everything changes. That's a couple of quotes which I didn't include in the reading, but this is some of his famous sayings. He was saying, you cannot step into the same river twice. Why can't you step into the same river twice? Can you?
What?
Can you step into the same river twice?
No, because the river is constantly moving.
So in one sense you can, because
I don't know.
I mean, yeah, like if it's a Mississippi, it would still be Mississippi, but the water is constantly different, right? So it's not going to be the same river in that sense. So that essentially what he means. Everything changes all the time. We will talk more about change next time, because Parmenides was another philosopher who spoke on that subject, and he had a different opinion than Heraclitus. So Heraclitus basically was saying everything changes all the time, and he was saying that is good, because the war, the opposition is a good thing. This is life. Everything has this opposition, day and night, hot and cold. And to him, this is a good thing. And this is, if you read the reading, you will understand. He talks about that. This is some of the quotes there. He's saying, unity of opposites. So opposites united together. They don't just attract, but it is essentially the unity. Here's the quote. They do not understand how, thou at variance with itself, it agrees with itself. More literally, how being brought apart, it is brought together. So by dividing, it actually is united. And he gives an example of attunement like a bow and a lyre. So what does he mean by this? You know, the bow and the lyre has a string. So how does it work? You have to pull it apart. The string is under tension, right? If you actually don't have this tension there, it's not going to work. It's not going to make a music if it's a lyre. And if it's a bow, you can't shoot the arrow from it. But the very fact that there is this tension is what makes it work. So the tension the opposites, the war between these opposing sides. That is a good thing. That is how things supposed to be. If you don't have that, you have a funeral. You have nothing. That's the end of things. And fire is most fundamental element to him. So essentially, you may say Arkhe is a fire, which is why the book kind of calls him materialist. I guess you can still say he is a materialist because fire is, again, it's not mental, right? It's a physical object, fire. Well, I don't know, today we don't really think of it as an object, but it is some sort of physical process. So Arkhe would be fire, and he's saying this world order, this cosmos, is the same for all, none of the gods or man has made, but it always is and shall be, ever-living fire, which being kindled in measures and extinguished in measures. So it's like this constant burning of the fire, which is what the world is, and it continues forever. It never started and it will never stop. It's this constant war of everything with everything. So note the important difference he has with Anaximander. When we talked about Anaximander, what did he say justice was? Justice was to bring things back to where they were. So if something is cold and it becomes hot, this is unjust, right? And he was saying justice is to make it cold again. Now note the difference with Heraclitus. He's saying war is the father of all and king of all. And some he shows as gods, others as humans. Some he makes slaves, others free. It is necessary to know that war is common and justice is strife, and that all things happen in accordance with strife and necessity. So to him, war and strife is justice. So he would say that it is actually unjust to keep cold things cold and to keep hot things hot. Justice is to make cold things hot and to make hot things cold, because that's how it is supposed to be. Can you see the point there? And this is actually from the reading, I believe. That's the quote. So
I understand it, but it's also kind of a destructive viewpoint of like, yeah, fire, war, go on, give it your best shot.
Well, it is provocative, but the point is to be provocative, because this is how you start thinking about things, questioning things, which is what philosophy is all about.